A teenage boy sat quietly in first class just holding his phone. But when a flight attendant spilled a full drink on him and walked away without a word, no one expected what he'd do next. Stay with this video because what this teenager does in silence ends up grounding the entire plane. And the truth, it was never about the drink. Before we start the story, comment below where in the world you're watching from today, and if you like stories like this, don't forget to subscribe and turn on the bell icon so you never miss one. He sat quietly in seat 2, his back straight, hands folded neatly on top of a worn paperback. His name was Eli Barrett, a 15-year-old boy with quiet manners and thoughtful eyes. The cabin around him smelled of lemon wipes and expensive leather. Eli had never flown first class before. This seat wasn't a reward for wealth or privilege. It was a gift. His uncle, a retired school principal, had surprised him with a ticket after Eli won first prize at a national science fair. Eli had boarded early. He nodded politely at the gate agent, smiled at the flight attendant at the door, and walked straight to his seat without hesitation. He knew the number by heart. This trip mattered to him, not because of where he was going, but because it felt like someone believed he belonged here. That feeling mattered more than legroom or a fancy meal. Passengers around him were still settling in. A businesswoman across the aisle was on her third phone call. A man in suspenders had trouble lifting his suitcase into the overhead bin, and somewhere behind a toddler let out a high-pitched cry that made half the cabin wince. Through all the noise, Eli sat still. He didn't pull out his headphones. He didn't scroll through his phone. He simply waited. The flight attendant, assigned to first class, walked down the aisle with short, quick steps. Her name tag read Miss Brenner. She was tall, thin, and her face didn't move when she smiled. Her blonde hair was tied into a tight bun, and her heels clicked against the cabin floor like a metronome. She handed drinks to passengers in row 1. Water, champagne, orange juice, each time with a well-practiced nod. But when she reached Eli, she didn't stop. She glanced at him, paused mid-step, and then continued walking as if she hadn't seen him at all. Eli raised his hand gently. "Excuse me," he began. She kept walking. He let his hand fall and lowered his gaze, pretending not to notice the 2 men in the row ahead, who looked back at him, then quickly turned away. A few minutes later, Miss Brenner returned this time, carrying a silver tray with drinks. The tray was full. Glasses clinked gently as she walked. Her eyes scanned the aisle, but she didn't look at him. Not really. And then it happened. Without slowing down, she turned slightly toward Ella's side of the row. The tray dipped forward, a full glass of orange juice slipped and splashed directly into Ella's lap. His chest, his thighs, even the seatbelt buckle dripped. The cold hit first. Then came the smell, sharp and sticky. His book still resting on his lap was. Soaked words bled through the pages. Miss Brenner gasped loud enough for others to hear. "Oh no," she said, drawing the words out in a theatrical tone. A few passengers turned. Someone chuckled. She placed the tray down, grabbed a stack of napkins from the cart, and tossed them onto Eli's tray table. "These things happen," she said with a shrug. "You'll want to clean that up before it sets in." Eli didn't speak. His face flushed. He looked down at his soaked pants and ruined book. The flight attendant was already moving again, her hands busy with menus and tray covers. No apology, no water. No offer to help. The woman seated next to Eli, a middle-aged redhead named Martha Green, shifted uncomfortably in her seat, but said nothing. Her eyes flicked toward him once, then away. The couple behind him whispered but didn't intervene. Eli blinked slowly. His fingers shook slightly, not from cold, but from something else. Humiliation, maybe, but deeper than that, recognition. He had seen that look on Miss Brenner's face before. That assumption, that disregard. He reached under his backpack, pulled out his phone and turned it on. He opened his messages, tapped on a name, Dr. Nolan Wexler. One message, that was all. She poured a drink on me. "No, sorry, everyone saw him soaked." He hit send, locked the screen, placed the phone face down on the tray table. And though no one knew it yet, not Miss Brenner, not the captain, not the passengers tapping their watches, the plane wouldn't be going anywhere. Not after that message, not after what came next. The phone in Ella's tray buzzed just once. He didn't pick it up immediately. He sat still, breathing through his nose, trying not to look at anyone. Around him, the cabin returned to its normal rhythm. A baby cried. The overhead bins clicked shut. A man coughed 2 rows back. Miss Brenner was already joking with another passenger about wine choices, like nothing had happened. Eli finally turned his phone over and looked at the message. Did she do it on purpose? It was from Dr. Nolan Wexler, the man who had mentored him for over a year, part-time university professor, former federal legal consultant, and most importantly, someone who had told Eli more than once. If anyone makes you feel small, you come to me first. Eli typed slowly. She didn't look sorry. Just told me to clean myself up. She skipped me before that too. The reply came faster than before. Flight number. Eli reached into the side pocket of his bag and pulled out his boarding pass. His fingers were still damp, the ticket slightly crinkled from being pressed against his soaked pants. He typed the number, carefully double-checking before hitting Send Flight 726, Gate 4, C. There was a pause, then one last reply. Stay where you are. Don't speak to her again. I'll take care of it. Eli stared at those words. He believed them, not because they sounded bold, but because Dr. Wexler was never dramatic. He didn't raise his voice. He never needed to. He just got things done. Up front inside the cockpit, the captain had just finished his last safety check when the call came through. It was a direct communication from FAA ground, coordination unusual and marked as priority. He picked up the receiver. This is Captain Roy Ellis. The voice on the other end was calm but direct. Captain Ellis, hold your departure. Do not taxi. We are initiating a compliance delay on your aircraft. Passenger concern has been escalated through FAA internal counsel. Captain Ellis paused. I wasn't notified of any passenger issues. You are now. Leave the cabin door closed. We're dispatching a federal compliance officer to the tarmac. Do not proceed until further instruction. He exhaled slowly, then said, Understood. When he hung up, he looked over at his co-pilot, a younger man named Brent. We're not moving yet. Brent raised an eyebrow. Weather? No, the captain replied, adjusting the headset on the dash. Something bigger. Back in the cabin, the flight crew began noticing the delay. A few passengers looked around. The usual announcements hadn't started. Engines were silent. The plane hadn't moved. Eli stayed quiet. He didn't touch his phone again, but he sat straighter now. His clothes were still wet, his hands still cold. But there was a strange steadiness inside him. He didn't know exactly what would happen next. But he knew without doubt this flight was not taking off. Miss Brenner was back at the front galley, folding napkins with too much precision. She hummed softly under her breath, as if she had already forgotten the spilled drink. The soaked boy, the silence that followed, another attendant. A younger man named Trevor Holt stepped beside her, holding a drink order in one hand. Hey, Trevor, said his voice low. Did you see the kid in 2? The one you dropped the juice on. Miss Brenner didn't look up. Yes, unfortunate slippery tray. Hell dry. Trevor hesitated. He looked really upset. She finally turned to him. It's fine. I've been doing this for 19 years. These things happen. You can pamper every passenger. Trevor didn't respond, but his face said enough. He glanced back toward the cabin. He'd seen the way she walked past the boy earlier, the way she didn't stop to offer help. He'd seen her before in these moments. Cool, dismissive, always quick with an excuse. I think he sent a message to someone, Trevor said quietly. Ms. Brenner blinked. What do you mean? I don't know. He didn't complain, but he turned on his phone and typed something. Right after you walked off. She stiffened slightly, then forced a smile. So you think he's calling a lawyer over a juice spill? Trevor didn't answer. He just turned away. The delay stretched. At first, no one noticed. A businessman in row. 3 scrolled through emails. A woman across from Eli kept glancing at her watch but said nothing. The engine still hadn't started. The usual pre-flight announcements were missing. Most assumed it was just a routine delay, but the cabin slowly grew quieter. Eli hadn't moved. His sweater was drying now, but the chill stuck to his skin. His book lay closed beside him, unreadable now. The sticky smell of juice still clung to the seat fabric. Across the aisle, Martha Green finally leaned over. Slightly, her voice hushed. Are you all right, sweetheart? Eli gave a small nod. Yes, Mom. She looked at him for a long second, as if trying to decide whether to say more. But in the end, she leaned back silent again. At the front, Captain Ellis opened the cockpit door and called out Miss Brenner. She turned quickly. "Yes, Captain, can you step up here for a moment, please?" Her smile tightened. She smoothed her uniform and walked briskly toward the front, passing first class with the same perfect posture as always. But her eyes flickered once, just briefly, toward Eli. He didn't look back as the cabin door closed behind her. The passengers returned to their stillness, but the tension had shifted. No one knew why they hadn't taken off. But something was coming, and for the first time in her career, Mrs. Brenner was about to find out what it felt like to be called out, not for breaking rules, but for believing she didn't have to follow them at all. Inside the cockpit, Mrs. Brenner stood just behind the captain's chair, her hands folded tightly in front of her. She had expected a routine update, maybe a briefing about turbulence or a gate issue, but Captain Ellis didn't swivel around or offer her a seat. He simply gestured toward the headset on the panel. "You'll want to listen," he said, his tone calm but unusually clipped. Ms. Brenner hesitated, then leaned forward and placed the headset over her ears. The line was already active. "This is Caroline Voss, FAA Compliance Division," came the voice steady and firm. "Who am I speaking with?" Miss Brenner cleared her throat. "Senior flight attendant, Miss Brenner." "Miss Brenner," the voice continued, "we've received a passenger misconduct report filed through an internal FAA contact involving a minor seated in 2A. Do you know the incident being referenced?" There was a long pause. Miss Brenner's jaw tightened. "There was a spill," she said carefully. "A drink tray slipped. Nothing intentional. Did you apologize to the minor involved?" I offered him napkins. "It was busy." "We were still boarding. Miss Brenner, we've also received statements that you failed to serve or acknowledge that same passenger earlier during service." "Is that accurate?" Miss Brenner's voice faltered. "I was moving quickly. I may have missed him. It wasn't deliberate." "Did you ask for assistance in helping the passenger clean up? Did you report the incident to the purser or document it in any crew logs?" "No," she said, quieter now. The voice didn't rise, but the weight behind it settled in like concrete. "You're being asked to step away from all passenger-facing duties for the remainder of the flight. You will issue a public apology to the affected passenger immediately. You are not to speak to him beyond that. Upon landing, you'll be met by compliance officers for formal review. This is now a federal-level investigation under FAA protocol." The line went dead. Miss Brenner removed the headset slowly. Her hands trembled just a little, but enough that she tucked them behind her back. She looked at Captain Ellis. Is this really happening over a spilled drink?" Captain Ellis turned his chair slightly, meeting her eyes for the first time. "No," he said. "It's happening because you treated that boy like he didn't belong in his seat, and now someone with real authority is paying attention." He didn't speak again. She opened the cockpit door and stepped back into the cabin. The hum of whispered conversation swirled faintly through first class. She straightened her blouse, smoothed her hair, and started walking down the aisle. Her steps weren't confident now, they were measured slow. Eli didn't notice her at first. He had pulled out a dry notebook from his bag and was writing something with a small black pen. It wasn't math or science, just notes. Things he didn't want to forget. The way the juice had hit his hands, the tightness in his throat, the quiet glances from people around him who didn't say a word. Then he saw her. Miss Brenner stood beside his row, silent for a beat too long. She cleared her throat and forced a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Mr. Barrett," she began stiffly, "I'd like to apologize for the earlier spill. It was careless of me. I regret the inconvenience." Eli looked up. His expression was neutral. "You regret spilling it," he said quietly, "or how it looked when you didn't care." A few nearby passengers shifted. One man lowered his newspaper. Someone behind them stopped scrolling on their phone. No one said anything, but everyone was listening. Miss Brenner's lips parted, but the words caught in her throat. Eli didn't press her. He just folded the napkin on his tray and sat back. "I think you should go back to your galley now," he said, not unkindly, "before more people start paying attention." She stood frozen for half a second, then nodded quickly and turned away. As she walked back toward the front of the plane, the silence behind her wasn't heavy with sympathy. It was something colder. Recognition everyone had seen what happened. They had just chosen not to say anything until now, and Eli still soaked and quiet in seat 2. I didn't need to shout to be heard. He had already been heard where it mattered most. The air in the cabin had shifted, not in temperature, but in tension. You could feel it in the way people sat a little straighter, spoke a little softer, and looked a little longer when no one was watching. The usual rhythm of pre-flight preparations had been thrown off, but no one knew exactly why. Except for a few people, like the captain, the crew in the galley, and the boy in seat 2, who hadn't raised his voice once. Eli sat still, his sweater damp against his back, the napkins now folded neatly on his tray table like he had arranged them for display. His book was ruined, his pants clung to him with dried citrus, and the cold had settled in around his collar. But there was no trembling in his hands now, no flinch in his posture. He had done what needed to be done. The rest wasn't in his hands anymore. Further down the aisle, a man in his mid-50s wearing a gray blazer and an expensive watch leaned toward the woman next to him and whispered, "They're saying we're grounded because of that kid." That true. The woman, a marketing executive named Janelle Rivers, kept her eyes forward. "It's not because of the kid," she said, voice low. "It's because of what someone did to him." "You didn't see it, did you?" The man shook his head. "I was still boarding." She walked right past him twice, didn't offer anything. Didn't speak to him, then dumped a drink on his lap and told him to clean it himself. She said it was an accident, he offered Janelle. Turned her head just slightly. "If it was your son in that seat, would that explanation be enough for you?" He didn't reply. Meanwhile, in the rear galley, Miss Brenner gripped the metal counter, her fingers curled tightly around the edge. The apology had not gone how she expected. She thought it would end there one forced sentence, maybe a nod from the boy, and then the delay would clear up like clouds breaking in the sky. But it hadn't. He hadn't let her off easy. He hadn't even raised his tone. But the words he spoke landed harder than anything shouted. His calmness unnerved her. It felt like the ground beneath her had tilted, and she didn't know how to steady herself. Trevor appeared again, now holding a tablet in his hand. They just sent out an internal flight notice. He said, his voice quiet. "There's a hold code on the plane marked as regulatory. That almost never happens." Ms. Brenner stared at him. "What does that mean?" "It means someone high up flagged this incident," Trevor replied. "From what I'm hearing, it came from inside the FAA. Her stomach dropped. "It was just juice," she whispered. "No," Trevor said, folding the tablet under his arm. "It was how you handled it." At the very front of the plane, Captain Ellis received another call. This one was brief but more direct than the last. "Compliance officer is on site. We need that crew member identified and removed from cabin duties. If she resists local airports, security will step in." The captain nodded, even though no one could see him. "Understood." He turned to Brent, his co-pilot. "Stay here, I'll handle it." He exited the cockpit, his shoulders squared, eyes sharp. As he walked down the aisle, passengers glanced up. He wasn't smiling, he wasn't carrying announcements. He was looking for someone. Miss Brenner saw him coming before he even reached her. She straightened quickly and tried to speak. "Captain, I've already spoken to the passenger." "You need to come with me," he interrupted, his tone, leaving no room for negotiation. But now she froze, then followed. They passed row after row, eyes tracking their every step. Eli didn't turn to look at them, but he knew what was happening. He could feel the weight of the cabin pressing in, shifting, bending around him. The silence was no longer avoiding him. It was circling him, taking him seriously. When they reached the front, Captain Ellis opened the door and guided Miss Brenner inside. She wasn't coming back out, not as a flight attendant. In the cabin, the murmur of confusion began to build. People asked questions, with their eyes exchanged half-spoken thoughts, but no announcements came. No updates about takeoff. No jokes about delays, just uncertainty, and a quiet teenager sitting in 2A, who hadn't done anything wrong. Eli glanced down at his phone again. A new message appeared. "Security team is boarding now. You won't be asked to speak, just remain in your seat. I've made sure the right people are watching, Dr. Wexler." Eli read the message, locked the screen, and placed it gently back on the tray. He wasn't angry anymore. He wasn't even nervous. He was waiting, and this time the silence didn't feel like loneliness. It felt like proof that someone had finally listened, that maybe for once, The plane wouldn't move on until the truth was given its seat. The silence in the cabin had turned into something sharper, like a quiet that listens back. No one had been told why the plane was still sitting at the gate, but they all felt it now. It wasn't a weather delay, it wasn't air traffic. It was something heavier, and everyone could feel who was at the center of it. Eli didn't shift in his seat. He remained upright, his sweater still damp and clinging faintly to his back. The smell of orange juice was fading, replaced by something colder attention. Every so often someone would glance at him when they thought he wasn't looking. But Eli wasn't ashamed. He was simply waiting. His hands were resting on his thighs, palms down, his eyes focused forward. Calm still, the way he had learned to be in rooms where people questioned why he was even there. The passengers had begun to whisper now. The murmurs were soft but filled with pieces of the same story. Why hasn't the plane moved? They called a crew member up to the cockpit. I think it has something to do with that boy. The 1 and 2, A from 3 rows behind an elderly woman with silver hair and pearl earrings, leaned toward the man next to her. He's been silent the whole time. Not one complaint, she said. That's the part that gets me. Her seatmate, a man in his late 60s, nodded. I saw her dump the juice on him. Didn't even blink. No apology, just walked off. Why didn't you say anything? She asked. He didn't answer. In the front galley, Miss Brenner sat on the narrow jump seat, her hands gripping the edge of her uniform skirt. The curtain was half closed now, but she could still hear the rising unease in the cabin behind her. Every sound, the rustle of a newspaper, the ding of a call button, the slow drag of a suitcase being adjusted, felt amplified, like reminders of a routine she no longer controlled. She looked up when the intercom crackled. This is Captain Ellis. We've received confirmation from ground control that an FAA compliance officer will be boarding shortly. We appreciate your patience and ask that all passengers remain seated until we're cleared for departure. He didn't say why, he didn't mention who they were there for, but it was enough. The cabin shifted again. The tension now had direction. At that very moment outside the aircraft, a dark SUV pulled up to the base of the jet bridge. 2 figures stepped out. One wore a black FAA uniform with a badge clipped to her chest. The other was in a navy suit, his ID visible, but his expression blank. They exchanged a few short words with the ground crew, then made their way toward the entrance of the plane. Inside, the gate door opened with a quiet click. The air that entered behind them wasn't colder, but it felt like it was passengers in rows. 1 through 3 turned their heads almost instinctively. No one needed to be told who these people were. Their presence spoke for itself. The officer entered first. Her eyes scanned the cabin slowly, then settled on Eli. She didn't speak yet, just gave a slight nod, acknowledging him without turning him into a spectacle. She leaned toward a nearby flight attendant and whispered something. The attendant nodded and disappeared toward the rear of the cabin. The suited man followed behind, briefcase in hand, his posture alert but unthreatening. Together they moved quietly past the first few rows and paused at the front galley. A minute later, Miss Brenner stood up. She didn't protest, didn't argue. Her lips were drawn tight, her eyes hollow. The officer gestured toward the door. A second airline supervisor had appeared now, standing just beside the curtain. The announcement didn't come through the intercom. It didn't need to. Everyone was already watching. Miss Brenner stepped into the aisle and walked forward. Her steps were slower than usual, her shoes quieter against the carpet. When she passed her seat 2, she didn't stop, but her eyes flicked toward Eli for just a second, an apology trapped behind pride. He didn't meet her gaze. He didn't need to. She walked past him and disappeared down the jet bridge without a single word. The door closed behind her with a faint final thud. The passengers didn't cheer. No one clapped, but the silence that followed carried something stronger than noise accountability. Janelle Rivers, still seated across from Eli, turned slightly toward him. She didn't speak, just nodded once, not pity, not sympathy, respect. Eli looked forward again. He hadn't moved, he hadn't yelled, he hadn't demanded anything, and still the system that ignored people like him every day had been forced to stop, not by power, by truth. The moment the cabin door clicked shut behind Ms. Brenner, Something invisible but heavy seemed to settle over the entire plane. A strange hush filled the first-class section, as if every passenger had suddenly realized they'd been part of something they couldn't explain, but couldn't ignore anymore either. The murmurs stopped, heads turned forward. Some passengers pretended to read others, scrolled their phones mindlessly, but none of them were truly distracted. Every single one of them knew now that the delay had never been about weather or boarding or logistics. It had been about what happened to the boy in 2A and what hadn't happened when it did. Eli didn't change his posture. His hands remained still in his lap, but deep inside something had shifted. Not pride, not relief, just a quiet steadiness, like a knot inside his chest had finally loosened. He had no desire to smile. He had no urge to say, "I told you so." That was never his goal. He hadn't started this to prove a point. He just wanted to be treated the same as anyone else who sat in that seat, in that class, on that plane. Across the aisle, Janelle Rivers closed her laptop. She had stopped working the moment the officer boarded. Now she simply watched Elena with concern, but with attention. She had spent years in boardrooms, talking about equality, inclusion, fairness. The same corporate words repeated until they meant almost nothing. But what she saw in this quiet teenager wasn't policy or politics. It was the purest form of something no memo could create, dignity that didn't ask for permission. Farther back in the cabin, Trevor stood just outside the curtain near the rear galley. He didn't speak. He was watching too, watching the people shift in their seats, watching the passengers glance toward too, like they were all suddenly seeing something they hadn't noticed when they boarded. And maybe that was the hardest part to accept, that no one had spoken up when they saw the drink spill. No one had said anything when the napkins were tossed down without care. Everyone had seen it. They just hadn't expected anyone to care. Trevor's jaw tightened. He wasn't proud of the way he'd stayed quiet either. Near the front, the co-pilot stepped into the aisle again and whispered something to a crew member. She nodded, then turned toward the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you again for your patience. Please remain in your seats with your seatbelts fastened. A short compliance debrief is being completed before we proceed with final clearance. We'll begin preparing for disembarkation shortly. Thank you." The word disembarkation hit differently this time. Passengers glanced at each other. Disembarkation. The plane hadn't even moved, yet Eli didn't react. He simply reached down, adjusted his backpack, and sat up straighter. Trevor moved forward toward the cockpit, hesitating briefly at Ellis Row. He leaned down slightly, speaking just above a whisper. "I just wanted to say what you did back there." He paused. "You handled it better than most adults would." Eli met his eyes and for the first time in hours spoke more than a sentence. "I didn't do anything," he said simply. "I just sat here." Trevor nodded slowly. "Exactly." He turned and walked back to the galley, leaving Eli alone again, but not unseen. Moments later, the door opened once more. This time it wasn't a federal officer. It was a uniformed airline executive with a clipboard, accompanied by an FAA compliance manager in a dark gray suit. They spoke briefly to the captain, then turned toward the cabin. The compliance manager, a woman in her 50s with short hair and calm eyes, made her way to Ellis Row. She crouched slightly beside his seat, not towering over him, not looking down, just meeting him where he was. "Mr. Barrett," she asked. Eli nodded. "My name is Officer Ray. I'm here on behalf of FAA Compliance. I want to thank you for staying calm. We'll be asking some brief questions after the plane is cleared. You won't need to say anything right now, but you should know this incident is being taken seriously." Eli looked at her, expression steady. "I figured it was," he said softly. "You grounded the whole flight." Ray gave the faintest smile. "No," she replied. "You did." Then she stood up and walked toward the cockpit. The cabin remained quiet. No clapping, no outrage. Just a slow realization spreading row by row. This boy didn't yell. He didn't make a scene. He didn't demand anything. He just sat down, sent one message, and the entire system stopped moving. Not because he was loud, because he was right. And now everyone on that plane had to sit in that truth, whether they liked it or not. By now the delay had stretched past 30 minutes. The kind of delay that usually triggered complaints. Grumbling voices, irritated fingers, tapping against armrests. But this time, no one dared speak too loudly. Not after what they had seen. Not after the uniformed officials boarded, whispered quietly to the captain, and acknowledged the boy in 2A with careful respect. The woman in seat 3B finally lowered her sunglasses. She had been watching since the drink incident, pretending not to. She leaned toward her husband and whispered, "This is going to be all over the news by morning." He looked at her, then toward Eli. "You think he's famous?" "No," she replied, her voice hushed. "But someone with power is watching his back in the galley." Trevor leaned against the wall, arms crossed. He had replayed the entire chain of events in his head a dozen times. How Miss Brenner walked right past Eli with the towels. How she made that half-laugh after spilling the drink. How nobody, including himself, said a word in the moment. Maybe it had happened too fast. Maybe they had all been too used to it, too trained to freeze when injustice showed up in subtle ways. That was the worst part. Not the spill, not the lack of apology. It was how normal it had felt until it wasn't. He heard footsteps. The compliance officer, Ray, walked past him toward the rear jump seat, where Miss Brenner had been sitting just earlier. Now that seat was empty. Miss Brenner had already been escorted off. Her shift was over, but her consequences were just beginning. Trevor looked at the officer, then glanced toward the cabin where passengers now sat unnaturally still. He wondered how many of them had already typed out messages they hadn't sent. How many had filmed short clips they weren't brave enough to post? How many, like him, were trying to rewrite their silence with afterthoughts? In seat 2A, Eli sat with his phone in his lap. He wasn't texting anymore. He wasn't reading. He was just thinking, quietly, steadily, with the same expression he'd worn since the beginning, calm but not distant present. As if he were still watching the cabin, just like it was watching him. Across the aisle, Janelle Rivers pulled out a notebook and began writing something down. She didn't know why. Maybe it was guilt. Maybe it was habit. But the scene in front of her, the boy in silence, the plane in limbo, the entire crew reshuffling, felt like something that should be remembered, not just seen, but recorded. Behind them, a man with a Bluetooth earpiece finally took it out. He had been on the phone when the drink was spilled. He hadn't even looked up when the napkins were thrown, but now even he sat straight, unsure how to rejoin the world that had moved on without him. Near the middle of the plane, the woman in 7C pushed her call button. A young crew member came over with a tense smile. The woman leaned in and whispered, "The boy up front, do you know what's going on?" The crew member just shook his head politely. "We're under FAA direction at the moment. Mom, that's all I'm able to say." Back up front, Captain Ellis stood in the cockpit doorway. He scanned the rows, his eyes pausing briefly on Eli. The captain had seen a lot in his 21 years. Angry passengers, medical emergencies, weather diversions. But never this. Never a flight that hadn't even left the gate brought to a full stop because of how one teenage boy had been treated. He didn't see arrogance in Eli's face. He saw something that unsettled him, more expectation. The kind of quiet expectation that said, this isn't right, so do something about it. Captain Ellis stepped aside as Officer Ray returned to the galley. Her expression was unreadable, but her pace was firm. She spoke quietly into her headset. Seconds later, a second airline supervisor stepped aboard, followed by 2 additional ground staff. A few rows back, someone whispered, "They're calling more people." This isn't over. They were right, it wasn't over, because something had been set in motion that couldn't be undone with a press release or a free flight voucher. Not this time a system had been forced to pause. Not by lawsuits or strikes, but by one text message. One seat, one soaked boy, who didn't yell or demand or plead. He just sat still, stayed polite, and refused to be invisible. And now because of him, the plane was no longer carrying passengers. It was carrying accountability. Row by row, the faces that once looked away now turned back toward Eli, not to pity him, not to thank him, but to face something inside themselves that had quietly agreed with what happened, until it was no longer quiet. The plane hadn't even left the ground, and already it had changed the course of every person sitting on it. The cabin lights dimmed slightly as the sun dipped lower outside the window, casting golden strips across the tray tables and the tops of folded newspapers. The shadows grew longer, and with them so did the weight in the air. What started as a delay had become a reckoning. No screens were glowing now. No one was laughing softly on the phone. It was as if every passenger had silently agreed not to pretend anymore. Eli leaned his head slightly against the window, the cold of the glass calming against the side of his face. He wasn't watching the tarmac. He was listening to every shift in breathing, every cough, every restless motion of passengers, not used to sitting in their own discomfort. But none of them felt what he had felt. None of them sat soaked in silence while being looked through like they didn't matter. Now they were only beginning to feel a fraction of it. The door to the aircraft opened again with a soft hiss. This time no one turned in surprise. It was expected now. Another official, another witness, another quiet figure there to observe, record, and file what would later become part of a formal report. The woman who entered wore a navy blazer with a federal ID badge clipped near her collar. She didn't say a word. She simply made her way to the front and began speaking with Officer Ray. Trevor stepped out of the galley again, carrying a small notepad he'd used earlier for service prep. He wasn't writing anything down. He didn't need to. Every detail was already burned into memory. He walked toward the first-class curtain but stopped before passing through. His hand gripped the edge of the fabric like it anchored him to something safe. He stood there for a full minute before stepping into the front cabin. When he reached Ellis Rowe, he knelt slightly, not to make a scene, but so he wouldn't tower over the boy. "I should have done something earlier," he said in a voice only Eli could hear. "I should have said something. I saw her face when she spilled that drink. I knew it wasn't just an accident." Eli turned his head slowly. He didn't look angry, just tired, not from the flight delay, but from what it took to make the truth matter. "You didn't have to shout," Eli replied softly. "You just had to ask if I was okay." Trevor nodded, once his throat tightening. "I'm sorry I didn't." Eli gave a faint nod. That was all. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't refusal either. It was a quiet acknowledgement, like a receipt handed over after a transaction that cost more than anyone had planned to spend. As Trevor stood and walked back toward the galley, several passengers tracked his steps with their eyes. Some looked thoughtful, some looked uneasy. One man in row 4 opened the notes app on his phone and began typing something, his hands trembling just slightly. Whether it was an apology, a confession, or a message he never planned to send. No one knew. Near the rear of the plane, the second officer, who had boarded earlier, stood beside the flight manifest. Reviewing names with a ground supervisor, a copy of the passenger list was being marked carefully. Line by line, crew member statements were being matched with seat numbers. The FAA wasn't interested in surface-level explanations. They wanted context, sequence, motive. What did the crew see? Who watched the drink spill? Who offered help? Who looked away? No one would be allowed to simply say, "I didn't notice." Back in the front cabin, Captain Ellis made another short walk past the rows, this time holding a clipboard in one hand. His face remained unreadable, but his jaw was tight. He stopped beside Ellis' seat. "You'll be asked to stay behind when we disembark," he said carefully. "Just for a few questions. You won't be alone?" Eli nodded. "Okay," Captain Ellis hesitated, then said, "For what it's worth, you handled this better than most of us." Would have Eli didn't respond right away. Then quietly, "I shouldn't have had to." The words hung there, not in anger, but as a fact. The captain gave a slow nod and moved on. Minutes later, the cabin phone rang again. A crew member answered, listened, then walked forward with instructions. The intercom beeped once. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your continued patience. We will begin organized disembarkation shortly. We ask that all passengers remain seated until the seatbelt sign is turned off, and your row is called. A crew member will guide you. Not a single person moved. In seat 2. Eli watched the reflection of the aisle lights in the window glass. Behind him, the whispers had stopped. Not because people didn't have questions anymore, but because now the truth was louder than curiosity. No announcement had said his name. No one pointed at him, and yet everyone knew this wasn't about a delay anymore. It was about what happens when you stop pretending that silence is harmless. And as the aircraft stayed motionless on the ground, everyone inside it had been forced to see just how far a single moment of quiet dignity could travel farther than any plane in the air. The sound of the seatbelt sign turning off echoed through the cabin like a starting bell. But no one stood. No one reached for the overhead bins or fumbled for their jackets. The usual clamor of impatient travelers eager to exit was replaced by something deeper restraint, maybe even guilt row. By row, the plane remained frozen, even as the crew moved down the aisle to begin escorting passengers off. But they weren't starting at the front. This time they began in the back, quietly guiding travelers toward the exit-making space. Making room for something everyone knew was coming, Eli stayed still, hands folded on his lap, eyes fixed on the back of the seat ahead. He had stopped counting the minutes he didn't need to. What mattered now wasn't how long they'd been delayed, it was what that delay had exposed and how no one could unsee it. As passengers walked by, some gave him brief glances, nervous, unsure, like they wanted to say something but didn't know how. Others kept their eyes low, dragging suitcases past him without a word. A few hesitated in the aisle, lingering just long enough for their silence to speak what their voices wouldn't. A middle-aged man in a checked blazer slowed at Ellis Row. He didn't speak, just nodded once. It wasn't pity, it wasn't shame, it was acknowledgement, the same kind of quiet respect given to someone who had endured something without asking for attention or applause. The woman with silver hair and pearls paused too. She opened her mouth as if searching for the right words, but none came. Instead, she gently placed a folded napkin on Eli's tray table. On it, scribbled in shaky handwriting, "You deserve better. I saw it. I'm sorry I didn't say anything sooner." She didn't wait for a response. She moved on, joining the quiet line shuffling toward the front of the plane. Inside the galley, Trevor was gathering his notes, his uniform. Rumpled now, sleeves pushed up. He leaned against the metal counter, listening to the pattern of the passengers leaving. He could feel the shift. He'd worked 100 flights, seen, complaints witnessed, frustration, even arguments, but he had never seen this a plane where the loudest message was sent by someone who never once raised his voice. Back in seat 2, Ellis' phone buzzed once. He looked down. Dr. Wexler, FAA. "Security will come to your row in a few minutes. They'll walk you out last. You did everything right." He let out a breath through his nose, a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. The rows were emptying faster now, the front section clearing. Crew members stood beside the aisles, their expressions more serious than usual. No one smiled, no one made small talk. It was a disembarkation like no other, more like an exit from a courtroom than a vacation flight. Captain Ellis remained by the cockpit door, arms crossed, watching every step. He didn't say anything as the last of the business class passengers left, but when his eyes met Ellis, he gave a small, respectful nod, not as a captain, as a witness. Finally, Officer Ray returned to Ellis Row. Her posture remained calm, professional, but her tone softened. "Mr. Barrett, we're ready for you now. We'll walk you out. The FAA team is waiting just outside the gate." Eli stood slowly. No rush, no hesitation. He reached down, grabbed his slightly damp backpack, and placed it over one shoulder. The folded napkin on his tray table remained untouched. He glanced once at the empty rows around him, every seat that had pretended not to see now. Vacant. Then he stepped into the aisle. The flight attendant at the front stepped aside without a word. The gate tunnel was silent. No movement, no announcements, just a short path lined with officials and quiet stares. As Eli walked, no one blocked him. No one questioned him. They simply made room. At the end of the jet bridge under the pale ceiling lights of the terminal, Dr. Nolan Wexler stood waiting. No security, no camera, just a tall man in a long overcoat with tired eyes and a face filled with pride. Eli walked up to him without slowing. "You okay?" Dr. Wexler asked, his voice steady. Eli nodded. "I'm good. They didn't hug. They didn't high-five. They didn't need to." Dr. Wexler placed a hand on Ali's shoulder. "You didn't raise your voice. You didn't need to. That's what they'll remember." Eli looked up at him. "I didn't want anyone in trouble, I know," Dr. Wexler said gently, "but that's not the kind of trouble they can ignore anymore." Behind them, just beyond the terminal glass, the plane still sat idle. A once routine flight now frozen in memory. Not because of turbulence, not because of engine failure, but because one teenage boy had quietly refused to be ignored, and the entire system had finally listened. In the hours that followed, the story began to move. But not from Eli, not from Dr. Wexler, not even from the FAA. It moved from seatmates and crew members, from passengers who had stayed quiet on the plane, but couldn't stay quiet once they stepped back into the world. It started with a short post on social media. Just witnessed a black teenager in first class get a drink dumped on him by a flight attendant. No apology, he didn't even speak. But someone made one call and the whole plane got grounded. I'll never forget it. That post was shared over 12,000 times in 2 hours. Others followed a blurry image of Elias Rowe, a quiet clip of uniformed officials walking past confused passengers. Someone even posted a close-up photo of the paper napkin left on the last tray. With the handwritten message, the caption read, "We all saw it." None of us spoke up. This is what silence looks like when it sits down in seat 2. By evening, the airline had issued a generic statement. "We are aware of an onboard incident involving a minor and a crew member. A full investigation is underway in coordination with the Federal Aviation Administration. We take all passenger concerns seriously." It didn't help. The internet was already 5 steps ahead. People weren't just angry, they were exhausted by the pattern. Different name, different seat, same assumptions. Back in the terminal, Eli and Dr. Wexler sat in a quiet holding room, just off the security checkpoint. No cameras, no noise. Just the low hum of air conditioning and the occasional muffled radio call. Eli sat on a bench, his hoodie zipped halfway, a paper cup of water in his hands. His backpack leaned against his leg. He wasn't shaking. He wasn't upset. He just looked still. Dr. Wexler leaned forward slightly, elbows on his knees. "You're going to be mentioned in a lot of articles tomorrow." Eli looked up, eyes tired. "I didn't want any of this," I know, Wexler said. "But sometimes when you don't want attention, the truth gets it for you." The door opened quietly. Officer Ray stepped in with a clipboard and a small folder. "Mr. Barrett, you're free to leave," she said gently. "We've gathered what we need for now. No further questions tonight. If we need anything else, we'll contact Dr. Wexler." Eli stood up. His legs were stiff from the long wait, but he moved without hesitation. Ray handed the folder to Wexler. "There's an official statement in there," she said, "and a written commendation from the FAA's ethics team. They were impressed with how calmly he handled everything." Wexler glanced at the folder, then at Eli. "He doesn't want a medal. He said he just wants people to stop assuming they know who he is based on how he looks." Ray nodded. "We're working on that too." As they left the room, a few FAA staff stepped aside to let them pass. One man in a dark polo shirt with an airport ID clipped to his collar gave Eli a short nod, not a greeting. Not a goodbye, just that same quiet recognition that had followed him since he stood up from 2A. Outside the terminal, the sky had deepened into a soft gray. The evening air was cool, and the lights above the pickup lane buzzed faintly. Dr. Wexler opened the back door of his car and waited as Eli climbed in. "You hungry?" he asked once they were both inside. Eli shrugged. A little. Wexler chuckled. "Let's fix that. First, everything else can wait till morning." They drove in silence for a while, the city lights stretching out in all directions. But the story they were leaving behind in that terminal wasn't going to stay quiet. Already emails were being sent, internal teams were gathering. An emergency meeting was scheduled for the following morning at airline headquarters. In a glass-walled boardroom on the top floor of a downtown office building, executives were printing out passenger reports, pulling crew schedules, reviewing CCTV footage. One photo sat at the center of the table, Eli standing in the jet bridge backpack surrounded by federal officials. This said the head of passenger affairs tapping the image is what the world is going to see. A child soaked in juice, treated like he didn't belong, and we all sat there while it happened. The CEO didn't speak. He just stared at the image. Another executive leaned in. "Do we know who the boy is?" The legal advisor replied, "Eli Barrett, 15. Gifted STEM student ticket was purchased by his uncle, a former educator, mentor is Nolan Wexler." Someone in the room exhaled sharply. "Wexler?" the CEO asked. "That Wexler?" "FAA Civil Rights Advisory Board." "Yes, sir." "That Wexler." The room went silent, and in that silence, for the first time, the people in power weren't asking how to protect the airline's image. They were asking how they let something like this happen in the first place, because this wasn't just a complaint, it was the start of a change they could no longer ignore. Morning arrived quickly. The sun hadn't fully risen when the first headline appeared. Not on a major network, but on a quiet aviation blog that rarely drew attention outside of industry circles. It was short, factual, and careful with its wording. Flight 726. Delayed after FAA grounds aircraft for passenger misconduct complaint involving minor. A few people saw it, then they shared it. An hour later, it was on a national news aggregator. By 9:00 a.m., every newsroom had caught the scent. By noon, the story was everywhere. Photos of the aircraft sitting motionless at the gate, social media posts with hashtags like Seat 2, he didn't yell, and grounded by truth comment, threads filled with both outrage and reflection. Some people cried, others defended the crew, but most stayed quiet and just read. Because the story wasn't loud. That's what made it land harder. He never raised his voice. He didn't argue. He didn't demand. And that silence exposed everyone else's. The media headlines varied slightly but carried the same weight. Teenager with first-class ticket, humiliated by flight attendant FAA halts entire plane. He just sat quietly. Then the plane never took off. One text, one truth. Airline faces national outrage. After minor removed from first class, seat journalists scrambled for comment. The airline's media team rushed to revise their statement. They couldn't deny the delay, too many had seen it. They couldn't deny the drink incident, too many passengers were talking. And they couldn't deny the consequences, because now it was being investigated under federal oversight. Inside airline headquarters, the atmosphere was no longer corporate. It was crisis. A long rectangular conference table in the main boardroom was now covered in files, digital printouts, social media screenshots, and timeline charts. The legal director stood near a large monitor with a pause video on screen, an internal surveillance clip from the gate area. It showed Ms. Brenner walking onto the jet bridge with a clipboard in hand. Just behind her, Eli boarded, holding his boarding pass, nodding politely to a crew member and heading to his seat. This was taken less than 20 minutes before the spill, she explained. The child followed every instruction, spoke to no one, never acted out. This was not a behavioral issue. Then what are we calling it? Asked the vice president of operations. The room fell silent. The CEO, Martin Kessler, looked at the image frozen on the screen. Ella's face was partially turned away mid-step, his backpack slung over one shoulder. He didn't look like a threat. He didn't look like a mistake. He looked like any other young passenger, except somehow he wasn't treated like one. We're calling it what it is, Kessler said finally. An error in judgment. One that now lives online and in the eyes of every parent who puts their kid on a plane alone. Across the city, Dr. Wexler sat in his quiet apartment, a tablet in his lap and a steaming cup of coffee beside him. Eli sat nearby, flipping through a paperback he hadn't opened since before the flight. They didn't say much. The headlines spoke for them. Eventually, Eli asked, "Do you think she knew what she was doing?" Wexler looked up. "You mean Miss Brenner?" Eli nodded. Wexler leaned back in his chair, fingers tapping gently against the ceramic of his mug. "I think she saw what she expected to see. Not who you were, just what you looked like. That's how this starts." Eli didn't reply right away. Then he said, "If you hadn't gotten that message, they would have taken off. Wouldn't they?" Wexler paused, then nodded once. Probably that thought sat heavy in the room, because it wasn't just about the drink or the seat or the way the napkins had been tossed carelessly without an apology. It was about how often this happened to people who didn't have someone watching, about how many times the plane took off with dignity left behind at the gate, about the stories that didn't get written because the person in seat 2, didn't know who to text or didn't dare to. And yet this one had been seen not by chance but by choice. Back at airline headquarters, the crisis response team gathered for the final time that day. The airline's chief people officer stood at the front of the room, her voice steady. "We're no longer discussing how to protect the brand. We're discussing how to fix the damage the brand allowed to happen." The board agreed unanimously to several immediate changes. All flight attendants would now receive monthly bias and anti-discrimination training. Crew would be required to log all passenger seat disputes in real time with Mandatory reporting for all incidents involving minors. A new internal role would be created, passenger rights, liaison reporting directly to the board. And every new hire would be shown a short video during onboarding, a reenactment of Flight 726. The final slide of the video would read, "Respect is not a luxury item. A seat does not come with a test. A child is not your judgment to make." That evening, a short clip began circulating online. It showed Eli stepping into the gate terminal, backpack still on his shoulder. His face composed, his steps calm. The footage was silent, but the caption underneath spoke louder than any voice. He didn't raise his voice. But everyone heard him, and this time they did. By the second day, the narrative had spread far beyond the aviation world. News anchors replayed the timeline in slow detail, scrolling clips of the runway, the gate, and that single image of Eli standing at the jet bridge, soaked shirt, and all editorial headlines now carried deeper weight. What Flight 726 taught us about assumption: he didn't make a scene. He made history. Why silence in seat 2A was louder than the intercom. Eli had no idea the world was watching. He wasn't checking news. He wasn't on social media. He was in the back of his uncle's car, a bag of clean clothes beside him, listening to the sound of the tires on pavement as they pulled into a quiet residential driveway. Inside, his aunt had made pancakes. She didn't ask about the flight. She didn't need to. She hugged him for a second too long and simply said, "There's orange juice in the fridge, but you never have to drink it again." Eli cracked a smile for the first time since the flight. Later, he sat on the porch, a blanket wrapped around his shoulders as the sky turned from gold to purple. He didn't speak much. He didn't want to relive the moment again. Not the cold shock of the juice, not the sting of being ignored, not the silent shame of realizing everyone had seen it, but no one had stepped in. Not until his godfather, and even then only because he knew who to call. Meanwhile, in classrooms across the country, the story had taken on a life of its own. At a high school in Chicago, a civics teacher printed the story and passed out copies to her students. "I want you to read this today," she said, "and then I want you to write down one thing. What would you have done if you were sitting in the row next to him?" In Los Angeles, a group of students organized a discussion during lunch. They called it "The Power of Quiet Resistance." Dozens attended. Some shared similar stories, times they'd been spoken over, looked through, moved aside. Others admitted they had stayed silent when they shouldn't have. That was the start of something honest. In New York, a journalism professor scrapped her syllabus for the week and said, "Today we study this, not because it's viral, but because it's necessary." Back at the airline, another kind of reckoning unfolded behind closed doors. Miss Brenner sat in a gray office, her uniform replaced by a simple blouse and slacks across from her. Two compliance officers reviewed her case, clipboards in hand. A company lawyer sat beside her, lips pressed tight, not speaking unless prompted. "Can you walk us through your actions again, starting from the moment you reached row 2? The lead investigator asked. Miss Brenner nodded slowly, folding her hands in her lap. "I was serving beverages. The tray was full. I moved too quickly. Did you apologize immediately?" I handed him napkins. "Did you check his name against the manifest before concluding he was in the wrong seat?" Her voice caught. "No, why not?" I assumed she whispered, based on what? There it was again. That same question that wouldn't go away. The one that made the entire aircraft stop moving. The one that no training manual could excuse. "I didn't think he looked like someone who usually sits in first class," she admitted, barely audible. Silence. Not just in the room, but across every department in the company, where people had read that statement and quietly wondered, how many times have I thought the same and just didn't say it out loud? Her termination was finalized the following afternoon. Not just for the drink, not just for the rudeness, but for the unwritten rule she had followed without realizing it was already broken. Assume less, ask more. Treat each person like they've already earned their seat because they have. And Eli, he didn't ask for her to be fired. He never even mentioned her name publicly. That wasn't the point. He didn't want revenge, he wanted recognition. And now it was coming from places he never expected. A letter from the National Aviation Ethics Council arrived 3 days later. It wasn't formal. It was handwritten by their director, who had watched the incident unfold from start to finish through internal reports and passenger testimonies. You reminded us that dignity isn't loud, but it's undeniable when we see it. You sat down, stayed still, and changed the conversation around what fairness looks like. You didn't ground a flight, you grounded a system underneath. She had written one last line in careful print. You made us all take a seat. Eli stared at the letter for a long time, then tucked it into the back of a folder he didn't label. He didn't need to. He knew what it meant. Back at school, he was met with stares at first. Some kids had seen the headlines. A few asked questions, most didn't. That was fine by him. During lunch, he sat at his usual table. He opened his book, thumbed to the page he never got to finish, and finally started reading again. No whispers, no pointing, just a quiet boy in a clean shirt back in his seat. This time, no one asked if he belonged there. They already knew the days rolled into weeks, but the story never faded. It didn't go viral and disappear like a passing trend. It lingered in inboxes and lesson plans in meeting rooms. Not because of outrage, but because something about it wouldn't let go. It was too quiet, too calm, too honest. And honesty doesn't scroll away easily. The airline eventually released its final report. It was 15 pages long, filled with timelines, passenger statements, and policy violations. But the most powerful part wasn't written by an executive. It was a small paragraph tucked into the appendix, direct quote from a crew member who had served on Flight 7 to 26. I was watching when the drink spilled. It wasn't loud, it wasn't messy, but I saw her face, and I saw his. She didn't apologize, and he didn't expect one. That's what made it hurt more. It felt like he had practiced being ignored. That line hit people harder than any press release. Meanwhile, Ellis' life slowly returned to normal, at least on the outside. At school, he became known less for the flight and more for his chess matches and robotics club wins. He didn't bring up the incident. He didn't have to. Those who knew, and those who didn't, he didn't owe them anything. But something inside him had changed. He now moved through rooms with a quiet awareness, one that noticed not just how people treated him, but how they treated others when they thought no one was watching. It wasn't paranoia. It was clarity. He had sat in the kind of silence that reveals truth, and now he carried that truth like armor. Dr. Wexler noticed it too. One afternoon, while driving Eli home from an academic seminar, he glanced over and asked, "How are you really doing?" Eli shrugged. Tired of what? Of always having to explain. Wexler nodded. You don't have to explain anything anymore. Eli turned toward the window. Then why do people keep asking? Wexler paused, then said, because they're hoping you'll let them off the hook. But your story wasn't about blame. It was about recognition. Eli thought about that. He didn't respond. But in his notebook that night, he wrote 6 words across a blank page. I saw it, I stayed still. And that would become the beginning of something new. What started as a single flight delay slowly became part of national discussion. Not just about race or travel or respect, but about the small assumptions that build into policies and the quiet decisions that become systemic. A university ethics course added a new case study titled, The Incident in Seat 2. AA nonprofit launched a campaign using Ellis' story to train corporate teams on implicit bias without ever showing his face. They didn't need to. The truth was bigger than the boy who carried it, and then came the invitation. It arrived in a clean white envelope addressed to Dr. Nolan Wexler, co-Eli Barrett. Inside was a formal letter from the U.S. Department of Transportation inviting Eli to attend the National Passenger Rights Summit in Washington, D.C. as a guest of honor. At first, Eli didn't want to go. I didn't ask for this, he told Wexler. They're just using me to look better. Wexler didn't argue, he just said, then make sure what they remember is how you made them listen. So they went. The event was polished, suits, cameras, speeches. But when Eli walked on stage to accept the recognition, the room went still. Not because of his clothes or his age or his race, but because of what he carried into the room without saying a word. He approached the northern podium, looked out at the audience of policymakers and CEOs, and spoke only one sentence. I didn't need to speak louder. I just needed you to pay attention the first time. Then he stepped back, and the room rose in silence. No clapping, no applause, just respect. Because some stories don't end with a standing ovation, they end with people sitting in their own awareness. And that was the true arrival of Flight 726. Not a destination, not a gate, but a moment where one boy's stillness grounded more than just a plane. It grounded an industry, it grounded a country, and it reminded everyone what happens when dignity finally takes its seat. Months passed, the world as always moved forward, but not without change. What happened on Flight 726 didn't become a documentary. There was no Netflix deal, no celebrity interview. Eli never opened a social media account, never made a speech tour. He didn't brand the moment. He didn't want to. It wasn't about being famous. It was about being seen just once when it actually mattered. But still ripples spread in every direction. Airlines across the country quietly updated their internal procedures. Some rewrote training modules. Others changed how incidents were logged, ensuring every drink spill. Every complaint, every confrontation was tied to a timeline, with names attached and accountability tracked. Behind the polished language and policy handbooks was one quiet truth: they didn't want another two. A moment, some companies pretended the change had been their idea all along. Others openly credited it to Eli Barrett. A few flight attendants formed internal support groups, safe spaces, where they could talk about how subtle biases had shaped the way they looked at passengers. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. One airline went further. They began a series of roundtable discussions between crew and passengers, especially teens traveling alone, people of color, and people with disabilities. The first meeting was awkward. The second was emotional. By the third, stories began pouring out. Real stories, quiet mistreatment, eye rolls, shrugged shoulders, mislabeling small humiliations that had added up over years of air travel. One young girl stood up during the fifth session. She couldn't have been more than 14. She said, "I used to think I had to earn my seat, but now I know I already did when I bought my ticket." That sentence became the new poster campaign across 6 major airports. Every passenger has already earned their seat. In smaller towns, teachers referenced Ellis' story in assemblies. Some gave students writing prompts. What seat do you feel invisible in? Have you ever been silent when you should have spoken? What does quiet power look like to you? Thousands of responses came in. In one, a boy wrote, "I never raised my hand in class, but now I know not speaking doesn't mean I'm not right." In another, a girl shared, "My mom says people always assume she doesn't belong. I want to be the kind of person who stops that." Eli never read those letters, but they existed because of him. Back in his own life, things had settled. School was school. Projects were due. Tests still caused stress. Teachers still gave too much homework. Nothing about him screamed the kid who grounded a plane. And that's exactly how he liked it. But every so often, a stranger would recognize his name in passing. A teacher might pause when calling roll. A flight attendant might double-check his name on a manifest, their expression softening just slightly. He never corrected them. He just sat in his seat quietly the same way he had before. But now there was one difference. The world was sitting with him. One Saturday morning, Eli and Dr. Wexler visited a small aviation museum just outside the city. They walked past the old jets, the weathered uniforms, the black and white photos of early pilots. In one corner near the modern civil rights display, a new addition had been installed, a single first-class airplane seat. A simple plaque stood beside it. Seat 2A, dedicated to the unspoken dignity of every child who was ever asked to prove they belonged, inspired by the quiet strength of one passenger who reminded us that justice doesn't need a microphone, just a seat at the front. Eli looked at it for a long moment, not proudly, not with emotion, just with peace. "I didn't know about this," he said quietly. Wexler smiled beside him. "They didn't announce it. They just put it there." Eli reached out and ran his hand over the armrest. It was smooth, clean, ordinary. He turned to his godfather. "It's just a chair," Wexler replied. So was Rosa Parks. They stood there for a while, neither saying much. As they left the museum, Eli looked back once. Not because he needed to relive what happened, but because he had finally realized something bigger. The flight hadn't grounded just because someone spilled a drink. It grounded because for the first time, a system was forced to pause and ask itself a question it had long avoided. What if we'd been getting it wrong this whole time? That's what Eli had done. He didn't just sit in seat 2. He made the entire world sit with him. And for once, they didn't look away. This wasn't just a story about a boy in first class. It was about what happens when quiet truth forces the world to listen. If this story touched you, please give it a like. Share your thoughts in the comments and don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more powerful videos like this one.